All right, everybody. Welcome to the bi-weekly cluster API provider for vSphere syncup. This call is, again, as a reminder, being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube, so everyone be on their best behavior. I went ahead and let me share my screen. Please feel free to update the agenda as we discuss it. This is what we've got right here. If you have anything to add, just add it after milestone next, please. And we'll be sure to try to get to it before the end of the call. But on today's agenda, we are going to discuss the upcoming milestone for 0.3 and what features that will include, what blockers we currently have, and as well as talking about the next milestone, which I'm simply titling Milestone Next. So for this release, we've been really focused on what we've been referring to as Kappa feature parity. We've had several people come to us and say, like, look, we really want to be able to use Cluster A provider for vSphere, but some of the way it currently works is a little too prescriptive for our situation. And they've played around with Kappa, and they really like the way that you can have a full custom kubeADM configuration. It doesn't prescribe CNI. Or if they've been developing it, they like the way it's organized. So this effort, sprint, whatever you want to call it, this period of work has been focused on trying to achieve Kappa feature parity, which includes support for custom kubeADM config, standard images via a stamping process, as well as supporting your choice of CNI. The milestone is scheduled for June 28th. We're still hopeful we can hit that. The outstanding items primarily focuses on this kind of massive PR right here, 307. I will be squashing a lot of that before merge, and I think I did just break it with something I added to it. I may pull that back out and make that a separate issue. It's actually listed as a blocker below. But the completed items include the CNI choice and image stamping. Both of those are currently complete, and you can see the PRs that link to them. So for those who weren't on the call last time, one of the big changes to CapV, in accordance with the CAPI community agreement decision, like this is how we're going to proceed, and we know it's kind of coming in V1 Alpha 2 with image stamping, it's no longer just going to be a BYO ISO. There will be, we are prescribing certain images that you can use to create clusters. That said, the process for creating the images is open. You can go to the CapV repo /build/images and see exactly how they're created, and anybody is welcome to create their own images and modify the existing ones, but there is a certain minimum requirement of what those images must include. That greatly simplifies the bootstrap process and allows for standardization across the providers. And again, CNI, CapV no longer deploys CNI to additional, what we'll call, I'm going to call it guest clusters. Real quick, the sort of terminology I think a lot of people have been using is the initial target cluster, the very first thing you stand up with cluster control, the thing that becomes the management cluster. That does have a default CNI of Calico now. It's up, you could still change that when you're using cluster control. You can give a different add-ons file and choose your own CNI. But for the clusters that you create with that management cluster, those will not have CNI installed on them by default at all. It is, again, the CAPI community decision that cluster API providers do not deploy clusters on which you can schedule workloads, but rather API endpoints which tooling or yourself can finish configuring. So again, the default CNI for the management cluster is Calico. Beyond that, we're not prescribing one. It's up to the user to deploy CNI. So blockers, what are we currently blocked on here? Actually, I forgot to add this. Let me go ahead, reintroduce cloud provider. there's going to be a little bit of this and next. Okay, so blockers. Right now, we don't currently handle multiple network interfaces very well. We do handle them, but not to the extent that the people to whom we've talked to would like to see us handle them. There is, again, it's part of 307, but I think I'm going to make it part of its own PR, a complete commit that, introduces full support for the CloudInit version 2 network configuration that allows you to specify as many Ethernet devices as you want. Each can have IPv4 and 6, although Kubernetes may not support multi-stack. The actual machine itself will. And static routes, address, custom name servers, all the good stuff. And again, it's at the tail end of 307, and I'll be separating it out. So while we are blocked on it, we have a solution. The second blocker is partially highlighted in 314, and I put it under milestone next because I think what we are going to do, actually, Andrew, if you don't mind, Andrew Sykem, would you mind explaining what I think our current plan is for 030, and then why we might even form some type of working, I don't know if working group's the right word, or phrase, but some type of separate effort, ephemeral effort to figure out how to best handle a cloud provider moving forward.
Yeah, so there's a few things here, but I'll start with the one that we're talking about today. The way that a data center, resource pool, data store, things like that are defined on a cluster level may not always be aligned with what the provider, like the cloud provider, sees in the cluster, right? So like in the vSphere cloud provider, you can specify like multiple vCenter servers, and you can specify on a local node by setting it in the cloud config file, you can set which resource pool a node, like a specific set of nodes should belong to, right? But when we deploy CapV, we define a lot of those on a machine spec level, and it's not always guaranteed that those values are going to match what is put in the cloud config. And there was a discussion also on whether those values should be set on a cluster-wide level, because we're like coordinating those values between like what is set on the cluster API and what is set from the actual like Kubernetes nodes may deviate. And so we need to define pretty much like what values can change between nodes and what values are going to be at a cluster-wide level and fixed at that, and pretty much align those two things so that we don't have varying values between what is defined in the cluster or machine spec and what is defined in a local cloud config file wherever. Is that making sense so far?
Yes, Andrew, I think it was great. One thing I want to clarify before people ask questions. I did remove the cloud provider config as part of 307, which is why I said reintroduce. I think it will be reintroduced for 030 the exact way it's been working. But that's in tree. And so we're kind of speaking both in and out of tree here. And with in tree, it's interesting because you could have different cloud provider configs per machine if it's a file on disk. Whereas with out of tree, it would actually be as part of a config map and would be a single config. So there's even some discrepancies between the two, and how it works today and how it may work with out of tree. So.
Hey Andrew, this is Siddharth. So regarding that vSphere cloud providers configuration, there is an issue that I had opened like long back. I think in September 2018, issue number 60, which essentially which we can probably just use if we haven't recreated a new one. Wherein the issue that I pointed out is just precisely the same, that the cloud provider configuration today comes from the master node VMs config, which is like completely arbitrary. And it should be completely abstracted out to say, okay, what is the cloud provider configuration that we want to use for a cluster? So
did you say 60?
60? Yes, 60. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I'll reference that issue to the other one I created. So yeah, let's probably offline, but I'd like to ask a few questions on that because I'm probably missing some context here on the way the initial things were designed.
Sure.
and again, we're in this really weird stage where, we're moving towards the out of tree, which could change some of this. I don't know how closely that's exactly the issue Andrew Sykem wrote there, aligning it with the cloud provider. But unless anyone has any objection, prior to 0.3.0, I suppose we will simply reintroduce the entry provider the way that it used to work. Just everyone be aware that, of course, that means that per machine, you could have different cloud provider configs. And that's just the way it's going to be. It's the way it used to work. We're not making things any better or any worse, but I want people to be aware of the issue. And it sounds like, Siddharth, at least you have been aware of the issue for, 8 months or so.
Right. So maybe one thing I'm not sure if I understood completely. So you said that there is a cloud provider configuration per machine. I'm not sure if that's.
If I'm not mistaken, right? You write that to each system with Cloud init, but doesn't I believe each kubelet has to have the cloud provider config on disk?
No, I think that's only on the master node, because I think there is because the vSphere cloud provider entry. I think. Again, I'm trying to recall. I mean, I
think the behavior changes. The behavior changes depending on what version, right?
Maybe I'm thinking of an older version where you actually had to have.
I think
there's two things. I know exactly what you're talking about. There's two things. One is older version of the entry cloud provider required to have vSphere.conf on every single node.
Okay.
That is no longer true. But
good.
If you want to use zones with the entry cloud provider, then you have to have vSphere conf on every single node, because it will have to have, each kubelet will have to have access to the vSphere in order to fetch the zones, the tags that are used for the zone support.
I'm making a note to check to see if the implementation on master supports zones.
We don't, so I can tell you right now.
Okay, good. So, Andrew, that simplifies things. We can just reintroduce this as a config file on the control plane node. But I'll take it offline. If we're doing that, it does beg the question if we should just move that config data to the cluster config object to make it more evident, since there is a single source of configuration now. But we'll take that offline.
Okay. I mean, so I guess what I heard is you're saying that we want to move that configuration into a config map. Is that some sort of?
No, the out of tree cloud provider uses a config map.
Yeah, I'm talking about like maybe the current entry version, not.
I'm not talking about moving it into a config map.
Okay.
The only thing we were discussing potentially doing is moving it from the machine spec, things like data center, data store, resource, into the cluster spec, since it's a cluster-wide configuration.
I agree. I mean, that actually, so what you just described is exactly what the issue number 60 that I pointed to exactly talks about.
Great. Thank you, Siddharth.
Yeah.
And I'll try to schedule something and send out a note to the mailing list, and we can have a separate call on that.
Sure.
So these are the two blockers as I have them listed for 0.3.0. Andrew, Fabio, is anyone else? Moshe, and you've been super thorough on GitHub, and I'm glad you finally have a chance to speak vocally. We've spoken a lot on Slack. I really look forward to seeing your involvement in this. Do you see anything else that we should tackle before the end of June?
Before the end of June, I don't think so. So I have some ideas for milestone next, but I think for 0.3, I think it's pretty full already.
Yeah, and I think this is hopefully setting us up to make it a lot easier to do future work on this. If you've looked, I know you've looked at the refactor, and as Siddharth has, there's feature parity, but I also try to organize things a little more closely to the way Kappa actually looks code-wise. We have, they call them scopes, but we have machine and cluster contexts now, and the services. It should be pretty straightforward to simply add functionality at a much faster clip, hopefully. I'm looking forward to feedback on that. So does anyone else have anything to address regarding 0.3.0? Andrew?
No, I think you got everything there.
Well, before we move to next, I actually wanted to review the open issues to see if anything we need to punt, or address them individually, what have you. So there's this. This is the PR. It's 307. I've talked about that. That is the PR for 265. Remove dependency on SSH. That will be handled as 307. If it's not clear, SSH is no longer used at all. The cube config is generated in the code via certs. It's not pulled from any of the nodes. Add support via load balancer. This is, I believe we have it listed as HA control plane. Was that the same issue, 245? Yes. So that is going to be something that we look at in milestone next, I believe. It's not something we can really focus on this time around. I'm going to go ahead and select that for which ones I'll move. Add programmatic support to set up. Does anyone disagree with that, about moving that to milestone next?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Add programmatic support to set up IP on VMs to remove the jump host. I'm actually not even sure what that means.
I think this is more of a CI case. So
yeah, I saw. The jump host. Actually, I'm pretty sure we can close that because the CI is going to change substantially. Although I haven't removed the directory, we no longer will be using the installer OVA. The bootstrapping method will simply be kind. And Fabio, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the consensus that we wanted to try to reach, unless anyone has any strenuous objections, is to only support the pivot case, because to not support pivot, people still wanted a way to track things, which is exactly what you get when you pivot. You get the state of the management cluster.
Yeah, so the consensus that we reach, I think it's unanimous on that, which is just remove the existing management cluster deployment,
and just always pivot.
Yeah, exactly. And at the time when we started, there was no kind. The requirement of having a working Minikube or a working desktop that had all the prereq to actually start up a cluster and then pivot was a little bit overwhelming. So kind is a much better solution for this, at least for the time being.
Yeah.
So maybe can you just clarify, what does it mean to say we're only doing pivot? I mean, I'm just trying to understand what exactly are we trying to say, that things that we are maybe not going to support, or
so the existing management OVA, a non-pivot case would be you deploy that via the OVA, and then you would use that as your management machine, your management cluster, versus using cluster cuddle to set up the initial management cluster as the what we call the initial target cluster becomes your management cluster. Those are two cases, but then there's the third, which is that you never have a management cluster, that you simply just use cluster cuddle. Anytime you need Kubernetes, you just use cluster cuddle to bring up Kubernetes cluster, and that's the cluster that you use. And so people are saying, hey, we've got nothing that will track things that we bring up with cluster cuddle. And the answer was, well, if that's what you want to do, then you're purposely not setting yourself up to track those clusters. That's the purpose of having the management cluster in the first place. So the way we get that will be using cluster cuddle to stand up a management cluster, and then using the management cluster to deploy new clusters.
Okay, but that's okay. So maybe I'm trying to just understand. So are we saying that we're going to, because there are two modes, as far as I can tell, they're literally just two different modes of operation, right? One is, as you said, where you have a management cluster in picture, which is where your controllers are running, and you use that to deploy n number of different clusters, child clusters, right? And in those cases, your child clusters are not running any of the cluster API stuff, right? They're literally vanilla Kubernetes cluster, which are managed by the central.
That's the only mode we're going to support, that one. It's just that the management cluster is no longer based on that installer OVA. It will be stood up with cluster cuddle.
Okay, right. But if you use cluster CTL, cluster cuddle, as a CLI, just to without, let's say we don't have any of these servers, right? So you're using kind to kind of be that temporary thing that stands up, and then ultimately in that case you still have to do the pivot. right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yes.
so we are supporting
Yes.
that as well. I mean, because
No, we're only supporting the pivot. The other mode is to not have a management cluster, to just use cluster CTL to stand up Kubernetes whenever you need Kubernetes, to never have the persistent management cluster.
So there is the third option, which is the existing management cluster. So if I wanted to deploy multiple clusters from one management cluster, then it's not create a management cluster and then create another child cluster. It's I have an existing cluster and create as many as I want.
I don't think I'm being very clear. What I'm saying is that completely forget management clusters altogether. Okay, if you wanted to deploy 3 Kubernetes clusters, you could take cluster CTL and deploy 3 of them without ever standing up a management cluster. You could just say, those are my 3 clusters, right? But after you deploy those, you've got no way of tracking them or knowing, what they're doing, or how to, you can't deploy anything else without using cluster CTL again with some kind as bootstrap. All I'm saying is that we're no longer going to support the installer OVA as your management cluster. You're going to use cluster cuddle to stand up your first cluster, which would be your management cluster, and then you'll use that management cluster to provision additional clusters.
But Andrew, the point is when you use the cluster CTL to provision, let's say the 3 clusters, as you said, like as and when I need 3 clusters, I ran cluster CTL command 3 times. And when it completed, I had these 3 child clusters that were created. Now at that point in time, cluster CTL would have already done that pivot of those controllers and those objects into those child clusters, where now in these 3 child clusters, you would have independent copy of the cluster API controllers running
I know,
with the
but
objects.
some people just suggested that you ignore that and just use those clusters as whatever you needed. That's why we're saying we're not supporting that case.
I think we're just saying the same thing without understanding each other.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the case. Because I'm just trying to understand which is the one case that we're not supporting.
Since I was part of the original
Please.
idea of the manager cluster, let me try to provide some clarity on that. So the original idea of the management cluster that we had in CapV was that you would have a Kubernetes cluster, pre-deployed Kubernetes cluster wrapped into an OVA that can take and deploy somewhere. So you can have right away a Kubernetes cluster that can accept cluster API and become your management cluster without you having to bootstrap that cluster yourself through cluster CTL or any other means. So that model, which worked for us at the time, we're just not going to support it anymore. But not the model itself, not the management cluster model itself, but more like the OVA we're not going to support anymore. So going forward, we'll still support the management cluster, but the management cluster itself will not be the OVA. It will be provisioned through cluster cuddle. So you run cluster cuddle, you deploy the first cluster, which will be your management cluster, and then through that management cluster, you can deploy an X amount of n amount of number of clusters through that child clusters of that management cluster.
Okay, got it. So just one question on that thought itself. So when you say you deploy the first cluster, which will become your management cluster, in that case, again, in the very first execution of that cluster CTL, the pivot is happening because ultimately it's kind of bootstrapped with kind and it does do the pivot. So essentially, once you have that management cluster, and if you were to do kubectl get clusters all namespace or kubectl get machines all namespace, you would see it's still kind of it's like the self-managing cluster at that point in time, just that single cluster. But now what we're saying is because now that is existing, now you use that as your placeholder to say, I want to create 10 more different smaller or different clusters, and you use that. Did I get it right?
Yes. Yeah, you would just use kubectl once you got your management system in place.
Cluster cuddle is being used just for the bootstrap, just for first deployment, for the first cluster, for the management cluster in this case. Yeah. Yeah. And Andrea was
not used for those additional guest clusters. Cluster cuddle is just used to bootstrap the management cluster.
what Andrew was mentioning, a different use case, which was just not having a management cluster altogether as a model, like not having a management cluster, simply not having it, and just using cluster cuddle multiple times to deploy a discrete cluster that have nothing to do with each other. Just, straight
yes,
up.
they would have all of those controllers running. You could ignore those and still use those perfectly valid Kubernetes clusters.
Yeah.
People have discussed doing that, but what we're saying is that we're not supporting that because it's silly to do that.
Well, it's not that we don't support it. It's that you just deploy something that will run the controllers but will not be used. Those controllers will not be used.
I also asked some of the CAPI folks as well if there's ever a use case where you would deploy actual worker nodes in your management cluster. Maybe you thought of doing that, and it was strongly advised that you don't do that because your management cluster also has root authentic, like it stores a root kubeconfig per cluster as secret, so you don't want to give other workloads, applications access to that. So like cluster cuddle, as folks mentioned, purely a bootstrap tool. You bring up your management cluster and then that's it. Like you don't want to deploy anything else on there.
Fair enough, but I guess that's depending on the way the first cluster is deployed. Like there's nothing necessarily preventing you to like deploying it and then, or deploying it in a better way, more secure way, maybe in the next version, or just deploying it and just going there and remove whatever you don't want it to be there. But I get your point, Andrew.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've bike shed on that long enough. Let me go ahead and let's see. So add support for HA. That is punted. Add programmatic. I closed this. Let me refresh this because it's no longer applicable. Create automated solution. So did I leave that up? No. So this is actually related to the image stamping process. Yes. And Travis Roden is actually working on this. I'm going to assign that to him. So if you were to go look at, and again, they're out there just so people could see if you hadn't looked since last time. These are the instructions for building the images, and includes where these images are publicly. If you were to do a gsutil on that directory, you would see that we've got images, I think, for 113.6.7 and then 114.0 through 3. And as soon as 15 is out, I'll create an image for that as well. That process still has to be automated, and that's what Travis Roden is on which he's working. And I know Moshe, I know you talked a lot about image stamping with Tim St. Clair at KubeCon. He mentioned it. I'm also going to give him the enhancements I made to the image stamping process that Kappa used, because he's basing the initial repo for the open source tool on what Kappa did. But I made some enhancements, so he's going to include those as well. So the good thing about that is that the new process in V1 Alpha 2 is based on a process that we're already using. So I think that should provide a smooth transition for us. So this is actually a real bug. Not that it wouldn't have been, but I mean, it's still applicable. This actually raises well, I don't think it'll be handled in this next milestone, but I think this is something that is a bigger issue. It's the way we currently do the CRUD operations. And Siddharth, I don't want to bike shed on this right now because it can take a long time. Let's get through the issues and see what time we have left. But essentially, it's if you quickly make changes to the state of a machine or cluster before a task is completed on the vSphere side of things, you can get into a invalid state. And internally anyway, maybe even on GitHub, I've mentioned that it may be perhaps worth looking into whether or not we want to take on some acceptable risk of trying to handle states a bit more atomically inside of single CRUD operations as opposed to asyncing things with tasks. What we have now is a very, very stable and thorough state machine. It just is also, Siddharth, we need to take a look at this because the task lookup isn't working at the moment. I'm not sure what's going on there, but it does raise different types of issues. I think this being one of them. So this is a very valid bug. We do need to work on it, but I think what I'm going to do, if it's okay with everybody, is create an issue that we can centralize the discussion on the CRUD operations. And depending on the outcome of that discussion, this may actually become moot. So let me make a note in the notes to see action items, create issue to discuss CRUD model. So what we have is very, very nice, but you can get to these weird situations with it, especially if tasks aren't working the way we think they should. And I think that actually might be related to the version of vSphere, Fabio. Siddharth, I sent him a screenshot of the clone operation task. He goes, I've never seen that before in my life, because it literally like listed like 6 tasks, and it's because we're on like 6.8 something, because VMC is a rolling target. So as soon as we did the clone, it came back into the create. It couldn't find the task. It had the task reference, couldn't find it, even though it was there. So not sure what's going on that. Maybe a vSphere issue thing, a vSphere version thing.
Could be.
So I'm going to push this into next. So add some, okay, this is a non-issue. I thought I closed that. Let me go ahead and close the SSH issue. Yeah, close, okay. And I know that we can close that because I've discussed that with Hui. So add, test, validate, bootstrap, and target clusters. Definitely want to do this. I don't think it's going to be too complex. It'll just be not an inconsequential amount of work, but I think it'll be fairly straightforward, because once you've got the kube config, you can do whatever you need to do to validate that they're up. Although, Siddharth, are we talking about maybe a subset of the conformance test, because we already validate that you can access the API server?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, can you go back to the bug maybe if you had? I think it was more of a. Oh, I think I know what. Okay, so I think part of it was also about, for example, when you define a machine definition, as part of that definition, for example, you could do. You can set some annotations as what you want in your target node, and this would be like, okay, you run through the test, you get to the API server, but at the end of the day, you also validate, for example, all your Kubernetes objects, for example, things like properties like your labels or annotations that you intended to have on your node, is that applied or not, and basically do a validation of that as well. I think that probably might be one aspect of it, at least, if not all.
Siddharth, could I ask you to take on maybe updating that issue with a comment based on taking a look at the issue and maybe clarifying it in a comment? Okay, so.
Okay, we'll do.
So if I remember correctly, that issue is also about validating their CRDs, their controllers for CAP-free.
Okay. Siddharth, I marked you on here. So I think that was Hui. Yeah, I didn't see you jump on, Hui. So Siddharth, you may be worth pinging Hui on that, and then we can figure out the next steps there.
Sure.
So, okay, and then lastly, in terms of outstanding entries to the milestone, write test for the Go vMommy provisioner. So this has actually been refactored a little bit to, I think it'll make this a little easier to do. It's still certainly valid. Moshe, we talked about this in Slack. I completely agree that generally integration testing is preferred where possible. However, I think that there are still some opportunities to improve coverage with simply unit tests. Kappa uses a gmock library, and if we put a few more interfaces around the way the Go vMommy package works, I think we can get some fairly decent coverage without ever even need to stand up something like Kind. So I do want to keep this as an issue for now, unless anyone objects. But I do think that it's worth making a note. Also look at how we can provide coverage with integration testing using something like vSphere.
Yeah, I was about to point that out. vSphere is
I
pretty.
already say it up there, but I just want to make it a clear comment. Yeah. The problem with that is that we might have to do enough things on the back end with vSphere that it doesn't end up being a whole lot different than Gmock, because we'd still have to update the vSphere model with IPs and whatnot. And then it has to, based on the way our stuff currently works, right, it's going to want to validate that it can talk to it via kubectl. And vSphere doesn't help us there. Although, Fabio, I'm actually going to assign this to you, not because I think that you'll necessarily end up writing the code, but remember radio container.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, it's already in there. I mean, it's already part of vSphere, so you can actually mock container running.
Yeah, so
it was a VM, so we can like add like an API endpoint there in a container and just have it run it and just, you know, validate kubectl connected to that endpoint potentially. So yeah.
So for those of you who aren't aware, there's an engineering conference VMware has called Radio, and people submit topics to it. And Fabio submitted one this year on which I did very little, but he let me be a co-author. And it unfortunately wasn't accepted, even though I think it was one of the cooler topics I've seen. Basically, we already use vSphere for a lot of things, but what it can't do is it can't mimic actual workloads. But Fabio had this great idea. Well, why don't you just use the container to mimic the workload? So you could literally use vSphere plus Docker or whatever to do pretty interesting and complex testing, as if you're actually talking to, you know, an actual vSphere environment, because you've got vSphere mimicking the VI SDK endpoint, and then you might have different container images running to mimic the workloads of those VMs. So
basically, it's simulating a VM through a container.
Yeah. Anyway, even the life cycle. So, all right, so let me move these to, I closed that one. Let me move these to next. Did those move? Oh, it's still running. Okay, so I don't think we have anything else for this. We need to blockers, network interfaces.
Actually, Andrew, I just remembered. Should we have an issue tracking like some of the docs updates I'm doing for the next milestone for one?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You've done a lot of that doc work. Do you want to create an issue and put it in milestone 3, or create an issue and I'll put it there? Great. So let me make a note here.
And Siddharth, I might reach out to you as well, because I think I have a few questions about the old docs. I'm trying to figure out like what can be removed and all that stuff. So I might.
No worries.
Okay, and then I need to do an issue. I think I will punt the network stuff into a separate issue so we can focus on the PR 307 as is. If it had passed, I'd have been like, great, but it failed because it didn't get an IP, so I screwed something up there. So create, pull network changes from 307 into new PR. Hui, there's one last thing. It's related to 307. CI, let me put this here. CI tests with 307 are flaky. Not sure why. I'm going to put you and me on this, or I don't know. I don't know how you're resourced, Twee. Should I put me as saying work with you, or should I mark you here?
Andrew, I think we dropped off.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to put him there since he's not here to object, and then I'll reassign me if I need to. CI test, CI E to E with 307. What it actually looks like may be happening, 307 started working over the weekend, but it's flaky, and it errors out at the very end. You get a 500 when it tries to patch a machine. And what it appears may actually be happening is the CI code to clean up the environment starts running, and the controller isn't necessarily through patching things. So it's like, I don't know what this thing is here because somebody ran kubectl delete, provider components, and so I don't know what this object is anymore. Anyway, it's weird. So We don't encounter that issue. I've run it through about 24 times with just kind, and I've never encountered that issue. It only seems to occur during the CI run. So I'm going to work with Hui on that. All right, so I think that's everything for 0.3 except for the doc updates, which you're going to create an issue for, Andrew. And then
one more thing.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, one more thing. Do we want to make any firm decisions around like Minikube support for bootstrapping, or do we want to punt that to the next release?
Is that part of cluster cuddle, right? There's nothing that we need to do specifically ourselves.
I don't think so, but we like the fact that none of us are probably going to test like the actual bootstrapping process with Minikube. Like, do we need to make a statement in the release saying don't use Minikube because we haven't tested it, or do we just like ignore documenting it and hope no one tries it?
I mean, unless somebody wants to volunteer to test it, I feel like Minikube has been an unfortunate, side effect of kind. So I will send out a note.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say I'll open an issue and we could talk there.
Yeah, okay. I was gonna send a note looking for volunteers to test it, but okay. So I think that's everything. We need to create 2 more issues for the 0.3.0 release, network changes, and the docs, and then there's mainly 3.07. So for people who haven't looked over 3.07, please do so. It should be fairly easy to pull down and test locally too. And so milestone next, we've got 15 minutes. We're only 2 weeks away from a release. So it's not a surprise that we kind of had spent some time triaging those. But since Moshe, since I know you made an effort to get here because it's not really great for your time zone, before we look at these, certainly won't have time to look at everything. Is there anything specifically that you want to be looking at for the next release so that we can prioritize those issues?
So the support the load balancer for HA, and in tandem with the custom cloud init.
So the custom cloud init is part of the 0.3.0 release.
Okay. So then it might actually be quite possible to implement.
You could bring your own load balancer to with a 3.07 PR. You could absolutely do that, but it's going to require manual work on your end. It's not just going to be seamless, but you can specify your own control plane endpoint if you want to.
So the way I've been doing that on other clusters is basically with a console server and a local Nginx or HA proxy load balance on every node. So your control plane endpoint becomes localhost.
So we're talking about 2 different things. There is just making it possible to use HA, which largely should be handled through 3.07. But then there's also in making HA or implementing HA as an automated solution if you don't have your own load balancer. So I don't know if you were on last week, but Fabio found this thing called Metal LB, and it may be possible to do ingress HA via new services that are appearing on Kubernetes. So you might want to take a look at this from the notes last week.
So Metal LB, I've actually tested that before. So that's going to work as a service type load balancer.
But it's not for ingress.
No, you can use it as a service type load balancer to an ingress, like an Nginx ingress or something like that. But it's not going to handle your API server.
That's what I meant by ingress, by the way. I meant the API server.
Yeah, so no, it's not going to handle the API server because its backing endpoint is etcd, so it uses Kubernetes to do the orchestration of moving the IPs, and if you don't have Kubernetes up, you can't do that. So you kind of need an out-of-band solution to the API server.
Yeah. All right. So I know Andrew from VMware side, Andrew Side Kim, has done a lot of thinking about the HA. So why don't I make sure that I make a note here? It sounds like that might be something that you and he, and Andrew, I actually don't know how you are resourced moving forward. I know that you've been working with me because we have this milestone coming up, and I'd love to keep you resourced on this, but that's going to be between you and Clint. But let me make sure that you're on this issue as well.
You can assign it to me. I'm happy to take this one. I've done quite a bit of thinking around this, and
I'm going to assign both of you because I think Moshe has too.
Yeah, and I'm pretty familiar with Metal LB, so I think I can add some value here. So yeah, we can talk. Are you on Kubernetes Slack?
Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to Slack me, ASI Kim there, and we can chat.
Cool.
Fabio, a random question. We don't have our own channel because I guess it's SIG VMware. Should we have a channel on Kubernetes Slack for the vSphere cloud provider? I looked for one the other day and didn't see one.
There's currently so
I just use Cappy because I didn't see one.
So right now, that's the best way to do. That's the best way to go forward for at least now. There's a SIG folding happening, and we're probably going to have some more like focused channels on like provider VMware, provider vSphere, something like that, which might end up being a best place going forward. But until that happens, Cappy Cluster API is the best place to discuss this probably.
For what it's worth, Kappa has a channel, so it actually may be pretty to ask for a Cap fee. But
that's the reason. That's the reason I was looking for one, because Kappa does. But
it's fair enough. I can take the action item on that. If we think it's a good idea, I can talk with Paris so we can get it.
I think that's completely automated now. So there's actually a repo you just send a PR to. I can send it to you after this meeting.
Oh, really? That's awesome. I used to bug Paris for all these things before.
Yeah, I guess she got sick of everyone doing that. So she asked for a more streamlined way to do it.
Okay, I'm putting this in action item, Fabio. So is there any other items that we want to prioritize for milestone next? We can close this one.
So then there's one other. So there's config admin as a potential alternative to Cloud Init. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing is actually modifying Cloud Init and templating it out. And what config admin does is basically give you a higher order or higher level API in order to do that, while at the same time allowing you to unit test that and apply it outside of Cloud Init. So I actually have a config I've actually just finished with an image builder based on config admin that will build an image based on a config admin spec, and then you can use that for your node bootstrapping as well. So it's
I think that actually is going to have to occur at the cluster API level, Moshe, because the image standardization is based on Cloud Init. I know from experience that the moment you want to support container Linux, you're kind of hosed, given that they moved to an Ignition, which runs much earlier.
So, well, this is so I'm actually proposing config admin for Cappy for the image bootstrapping.
Oh, the bootstrap
or
control.
The image stamping, and that. But for this use case, I think that we can implement quite a few features if we switch to that, and then, like for example, the networking and adding in a console-based load balancer, it become a lot easier if the constructs for generating Cloud Init become easier.
I like where your head is at. I think once we can align ourselves more closely with Kappa and can then focus on these discussions at the Cappy level and are able to pull in those features into CapV as quickly as the people working on Kappa are able to do so, that is where we're able to drive those discussions. I want to be careful about taking things too out of line with what they're doing, because we end up not being in sync with them. We can't use community produced tools necessarily. So yeah, I mean, I think what we're doing is saying like CapV would like to do this, and that raises the priority of that as a potential implementation at the CAPI level, whether it's in the Bootstrap working group. I know they have a Bootstrap work stream. Have you raised this there?
So what I'm doing is very much in line with the machine state model for Alpha 2. So that config admin, I'll probably create a Bootstrap controller based on config admin for that.
You raised a good point about
but I think okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll discuss it in Kappa A and Cap E, and then start there and then bring it downstream here.
You know, that sounds good. And something you said made me think of something that we need to resolve. Probably won't be today, but we need to figure out whether or not milestone next is going to be aligned with Alpha 1 or Alpha 2. Because I'm not sure, based on the upstream discussions in Alpha 2, when they actually plan on having that available. It sounds like maybe not before the end of the year, and we may still want to do additional releases before then. So
yeah,
maybe even in our next call, as we're running out of time, we can actually plan out the milestones based on the planned drop of V1 Alpha 2. And we might think that, hey, if we want, 2 more releases before that, then we can sort of align some issues there and deprioritize things that may be handled in Alpha 2 more simply, or for things that may just seg nicely into Alpha 2 without a lot of tech debt and disruption. We can focus on those earlier. But I think we need some clarity around when V1 Alpha 2, they actually think it might be available.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we should probably try and get some feedback tomorrow.
I'll reach out to Andy Goldstein. He's driving a lot of that from within VMware, and see what his thoughts are on that. I may just hit the upstream channel. But it brings up a good point in that, did I have this open anymore? I thought I did. For all these outstanding issues that we have assigned to milestone next, even where they're rotten, I'm going to try to find some time to go through them and figure out which ones may be covered in V1 Alpha 2, and if we want to deprioritize them for that, or which ones won't be covered. It's probably a better way to look at it, and see if we want to hit those in the next release. Fabio, what are you have any thoughts? Go ahead.
Maybe you should create a V1 Alpha 2 milestone and just push things that we know will only be in V1 Alpha 2 into there, and then we know a subset.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree. I'm having a V1 Alpha 2 milestone, because from my understanding, by following the cluster API, the CAPI discussions, V1 Alpha 2 has been downsized a little bit, well, more than a little bit.
A lot.
So, yeah. So instead of being like something scheduled for like later this year or like end of the year, it's probably going to come sooner than that. So it's probably worth like start tracking that.
Is it still going to include the removal of actuators in favor of controllers?
That is my understanding, yes.
So downsized, but not so much so that it doesn't flip the entire architecture on its head.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully they. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if the extension work group came to any type of conclusions.
I'm not super up to speed with all the discussions happening there, because there's multiple like streams of people trying to get to conclusion.
So what I've kind of seen is that the machine state and bootstrap type controller model is that's kind of the focus, as far as I know. I'm not sure if they're going to move from actuators to controllers for Alpha 2.
So we're almost out of time, but I also wanted to point out something that occurred to me over the weekend. I'll create an issue because I can't remember exactly what. I'm getting too old. A lot of what I've seen with the V1 Alpha 2 bootstrapping controller is based on the idea that there is a metadata server. And I don't know how well the on-prem case is where there is no metadata server is being represented. So I think we need to... Go ahead.
I don't think metadata server is a requirement for the Bootstrap controller. The Bootstrap controller, basically, you define some arbitrary spec on your machine object, and you have another external object, a controller that will then basically create your cloud in it, or whatever it is, Ignition, whatever your Bootstrap provider is, and then hand that off to your infrastructure provider to go and use. So
but I hear you. It's that middle step that's important for CapV, because our metadata that gets written to the instance data file by Cloud Init is generated by us currently in the machine actuator. People like Kappa, that metadata that then gets written to the instance data JSON is something that is provided through their AWS data source. We actually have to provide that metadata ourselves. It doesn't get just injected, or the data source that we use doesn't just get to pull that from somewhere. So if their Bootstrap controller only is injecting things with user data, we need to make sure that this is the issue that I realized. We need to make sure that it has the ability, or we have the ability to enhance things so that if we need to inject something with metadata, that can happen as well.
okay.
Okay, I think we are out of time. If you have any questions regarding something that we didn't discuss today, or you would like to see things prioritized differently for the next milestone, please reach out to us on the Kubernetes Slack, or myself, Andrew, Fabio, and we can always discuss things there. Fabio, as soon as you look into getting that channel created, then we can send out a notice and start having those discussions there as sort of the launching point. All right, everyone, thank you for attending. I look forward to this next release. Thanks again.
Okay.
Good job, everyone. All right.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.